Hello, welcome. I'm Dr. Stephen Kleinman, and our guest today is Dr. Susan Boser. Dr. Boser has been a professor in the sociology department here at Indiana University of Pennsylvania since 2002, and is currently a full professor as well as the assistant chair of the sociology department. Recently, Dr. Boser decided to dip her toes into the political realm when she ran for and won the 2018 Democratic primary in Pennsylvania's newly drawn 15th Congressional District. Dr. Boser will be facing the 5-term congressional Republican Glenn Thompson, who currently represents Pennsylvania's 5th district. However, the state redrew district lines in February of this year, and both will now be vying for the 15th district seat. Dr. Boser won the Democratic primary earlier in the year with nearly 75% of the vote. Pennsylvania has 18 House seats, 6 are currently held by Democrats, 10 by Republicans, and 2 are vacant. The election will be held on Tuesday, November 6th, and will be the first midterms under President Donald Trump, and the stakes could not be higher. We are lucky enough to have her here in the studio with us today. Dr. Boser, how are you?
I'm wonderful. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, and well, thank you again so much for coming in.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely. So I think what a lot of people want to know, and a lot of our audience wants to know, is interested, is why now? Why your first time getting into politics is now the time, and
it's
maybe
Congress,
Congress, and going straight to Congress, which is a big jump.
Yes.
So maybe a little bit about your background and what brought you out.
And what the heck I'm doing.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me actually start with why I'm doing this, and some background is probably useful for that. I'm 61 years old. Okay, I'm a grandmother. I have a 2-year-old grandson. And I have 3 grown kids, none of whom live here in Indiana. They would all like to, but they're not able to find jobs that pay the wages that they would need to raise their families. I worked for the first 20 years of my career in human services, and still in a rural Appalachian region, just the other side of the New York State border. And I worked with children and families. I worked in drug and alcohol treatment. I did work that permitted me to work with families in their homes and see the conditions that they were struggling with. And one of the big things that I learned was that the issue was first and foremost not lack of will or bad character. The issue was poverty. People who were living under the terrible, terrible strains of poverty and the worry and the depression and the anxiety that it brings struggle with a host of other social problems as well. I decided after working with that for 20 years and seeing how, from the ground level, how the human service system was set up in ways that didn't necessarily work well for people in terms of what they needed, I made a decision to learn more about the role of government in social policy, and also how in what ways could structure be modified to permit people to have more of an equal opportunity, okay? If you worked hard, how could you actually have a better shot at doing well? And so I went to Cornell, and I studied human services specifically, but within the Department of Policy Analysis and Management. And while I was there, I did a study in partnership with commissioners of 4 rural counties that looked at were there ways in which we could take regulations and also funding streams, specifically including Medicaid as well, and restructure them at the local level to put them under local control, so that what we were dealing with were not policies and regulations that were adapted for cities and suburban areas, but rather system design that worked for people in rural areas, because it's really quite different. Okay. We put together the policy, we put it before the legislature in New York, was where I was living at the time, and it was passed, and it was made into law. We received an award from the governor for our work for innovation in behavioral health care in rural areas. So a very exciting time, and following that, I took a position here teaching at IUP, and I've been here ever since. But because I teach social problems and social policy, what I've been doing is teaching over the years and monitoring what's actually happening in rural areas. And you can draw a line between what's happening in these 15 or 14 counties in the 15th district, which are higher rates of poverty than the state on average, lower per capita income than the state on average, higher rates of opium dependency and deaths due to opioids than the state average, and believe it or not, higher rates of suicide in these rural areas than the state average as well. And these things are increasing at a faster rate in rural areas than they are in the cities. And when I was watching these trends take place and seeing that the grown children, our students, would like to very often go back home but aren't able to because they can't make a living wage there. You're seeing then the natural supports in the small towns and the rural areas get gutted out because parents help their grown kids by babysitting their grandchildren, and as parents age, grown kids often care for them. But with those grown kids unable to live here, mine are in Meadville is the closest, Richmond, Virginia, and Columbus, Ohio. I can't babysit. They can't care for me as I get elderly. This is gutting the natural support systems in our small towns. And the answer are policies. But then take a look at what Congress has been doing. The kinds of decisions that have been made in our Congress over recent years are looking to actively gut the healthcare system, are temporarily giving a small tax break to working class people, but a permanent large tax break to the wealthy. That's not helping people here. And there's things they haven't done that they could have. So I've been watching that, I've been seeing what they've been doing, and then in my district, an opening came up. And the last two times I've gone to vote for a congressman, there was no Democrat running. It was the same person, unopposed, and I thought it's just wrong. People should have a choice. He stepped down this year. I tried actually to find somebody else to vote and to vote for and to run, and I wasn't able to. And I worked with a team. We weren't able to find somebody else, and I decided that I would throw my hat in. Started in that, then we had the redistricting, and I decided to go forward in the 15th.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, all right. I think so. One of the things you mentioned in one of my questions I had for you was, you talk about job growth being maybe the #1 priority of your campaign. It really
is for me, yeah.
And something I was curious about, and you really just talked about it, was that do you think the 15th district is unique to Pennsylvania and unique to the country as a whole in terms of that need for job growth? And if that is the case, which it sounds like it is, what are the policies then?
Okay. Well, a couple things. First of all, what we're seeing in the 15th has certain unique features, okay? And that we've got coal mining, we've got Marcellus shale. So we have certain things. We have manufacturing that didn't recover after the recession. So it's unique in some of those characteristics, but in a lot of other characteristics it's not. The bottom line is that rural areas across the country are struggling, and it has a lot to do with the way in which money and big money, corporate money, and multinational corporations have really been consolidating their power with Congress, and consolidating practices in such a way that they're gutting the businesses that happen in small local levels. And so that, to a large extent, I think is what's happened here. And so while the particular assets that we have to bring, I think, are unique to us, and even within the 15th, each county is a little bit different too. It still is something that's in common with rural areas in general. So specifically, what would we do? My recommendations for this area: #1, one of the single biggest things that we could do is build our infrastructure in a couple of different ways. One of the obvious ways, obviously, is roadways, bridges, etc. You can't have a business in a town if there aren't roads to get there that a tractor trailer can travel on, and that's a case for an awful lot of our towns. But in an even more significant way right now for us, I think, is we need to develop high-speed broadband internet access throughout the entire rural area. It's not there. It's not there, and I don't think a lot of people know that. I think if you live in Indiana, or if you're living in Pittsburgh or Philly or Harrisburg, you assume it's throughout the areas, and it's not. If you drive up, for example, to Punxsutawney, next county to the north of us, and in this district, drive up there on a weeknight, and during the school year, one of the things you'll see is parents sitting in the parking lot of the McDonald's, taking advantage of the online access so their kids can download their homework. Okay? Seriously. But so it's education. It means that people who want to retrain can't take advantage of online classes because they can't download. You can't have small businesses that are able to do their banking, do their marketing, do their consultations, secure sales, access their supply chain electronically, digitally, and that's how business is conducted these days. But they're completely shut out from that because they don't have high-speed access. That has to be taken care of, and furthermore, it could be. So that's a huge part for me, okay?
Yeah.
But there's others. I think that the answer for us is to really invest in both regulations and policies and also supports for small businesses specifically. For example, for supports, we should have low-interest loans available. Right now, small business wants to get started, they have to take out loans that are quite high and are not competitive for them. They're saddling them with that. Secondly, one of the single biggest issues, and I'm going to come back to this a little bit later, is healthcare. If I have a job right now where my healthcare is paid for and I have a great idea and I'd like to work for myself, I risk hugely take my family's well-being if I lose that healthcare to go into business by myself, but the cost is prohibitive. Third, I think that we also need to be looking much more closely, and this is Congress's responsibility, at antitrust legislation. I think the big ones are getting way too big. And I think they're determining policies in some ways that are undercutting and actively harming small business in this country. And I think we need to be looking at that.
All right. So you also mentioned your history with drug and alcohol and the opioid crisis. Treatment, excuse me, yes, of course. The opioid crisis is something that's gotten a lot of attention nationally.
Yes.
And Pennsylvania, I believe the most recent data from the CDC says was the 4th highest rate of overdose in the country. So obviously it is a major problem affecting Pennsylvania. And as you said, the 15th district maybe even more so than others.
Correct.
So what's going on in the 15th district again, and how do we fix that?
Honestly, what I'm going to come back to, well, let me back up. First of all, the same things that are taking place in other areas are taking place here as well in terms of overprescription, et cetera. Okay, so those same opportunities exist, but I think there's a couple of things that make it worse. One is frankly poverty. When people, especially in this area where we've had so many adults who have maybe had a job working in the coal mines, bringing home a decent salary, having benefits, able to take care of their family, when they're no longer able to do those jobs and they're driving 40 miles to a Sears to be able to get work that's not full-time and not paying good wages, and then struggling to, do I pay this bill or this bill? Okay, how do I provide for my kids? I think that people who are experiencing that sometimes can have difficulty looking themselves in the mirror. And then if they become hooked on a pain medication, I think there's a whole lot more that makes it difficult for them to fight their way back out. So the poverty absolutely, in my sense, has a role. But another part of it, though, is access to treatment. There are limited options in these 15 counties for treatment. And limited health care and problems with access, both in terms of availability and also funding. So I think that's why we're seeing a prevalence of it here. So
with that in mind, what is your take on marijuana laws in the state of Pennsylvania, and where should they go?
I support legalization, and not just for medical use. I support legalization for recreational use. Okay? And I felt that way for a long time. The research on it does not support marijuana being classed as it is. It is not, according to research, it's not anything that is worse for you than alcohol, and in some ways not even as bad. It doesn't have the addictive properties that alcohol has for some, for example. But in addition to that, think about the possibilities. If it was legal and we taxed it, if it was legal and it became an agricultural product we could be growing here, tax it, regulate it, make it a cash crop, as far as I'm concerned. And I think that legalization is long overdue.
So switching topics a bit,
okay,
if we can. You grew up in a small town in a rural community, and
I did.
And you say in a home where guns were prevalent and
Yep.
hunting occurred often.
Yep.
You also say that there's a need for common sense gun laws. What do those look like? And
Okay.
on a side note, secondary
Sure.
note, as a professor, we've seen in this country school shootings, and as a professor myself, that is something that is on my mind. How do we?
What do we do with
What
this?
do we do with all that?
Yeah, I think that the issue of guns in our country has been, that lines have been drawn around it and messaging has been drawn around it that has everything to do with the fact that the gun manufacturers who make a profit from sale of guns are heavily investing in our congressional representatives. I think that there are ways in which the messaging has been put out that leaves people feeling very, very unsafe about their rights. And I appreciate that. As you said, I do come from a gun culture. My dad was a hunter. My son-in-law is still a hunter. I've probably got venison in the freezer right now. I've cooked it on lots of occasions. I was in the rifle club when I was in high school, okay? So I get this, and furthermore, I respect it. I also support the Second Amendment. That said, I'm also a grandmother. I'm a teacher, as you say, and we had an incident actually when my kids were in high school here in Indiana. I had 2 kids in the school at the time. And there was a man who approached the school, and they thought that he had a gun. And it was after one of the first shootings had taken place. And I was terrified, absolutely terrified. It brings tears to my eyes actually to think about it. It turned out good for the kids, and that none of the kids were harmed. And the person, I don't think, had an actual weapon, but the man himself was killed outside of the school. So our kids were also witness to that as well. So in terms of our culture, there are lots of things that are happening that should not be. And I don't think that people going to church or people going to a concert, and certainly not our children in schools, should have to be frightened. And I know that that fear is there. I think the answer to this lies in looking specifically at putting together some kind of controls around military-grade weapons that are designed and intended to kill people. And I think that the policies that we have around this should be framed and should actively involve people who are sportsmen, people who are gun owners, who respect their weapons and care for their weapons. Less input from the gun manufacturers who are making a profit from this.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So I think the current state of politics is something that is talked about a lot, and it's seen in the media. And it is very combative these days, and Washington is looked at by many people as a place where people aren't really representing their constituents, but their own needs and their own wants, and there's a lot of arguing, which is contradictory to what the research and what theory tells us about how we should engage in democratic politics, which is a discussion between people of differing opinions that come together to find the best solution.
Compromise.
If you are voted in, will you be reaching across the aisle to Republicans and trying to bridge the gap there?
Absolutely. Matter of fact, I'm doing it right now. But I want to say something about that climate. That climate of divisiveness and aggression on both sides, quite frankly, to my mind, has everything to do with the big money that's in politics. If you take a look at the amounts of money that are being used to fund congressional races, or the ways in which threats to fund an opponent in the next primary if a congressperson doesn't automatically vote the way somebody wants them to do it, it has completely taken attention off of the needs of the districts we're there to represent, and it's put it on trying to meet the needs of the donors. And I think that is the single biggest thing that's happening right now, and I think it's what's prohibiting compromise. And so one of the things I want to work with colleagues on both sides of the aisle on very early, quite honestly, is campaign finance reform. I'll also tell you, though, that sense of the role of big money, I feel it so strongly that I have made a commitment, and I'm honoring that commitment, not to take any corporate donations whatsoever. I take no money from corporations or from corporate PACs. Okay? My commitment is to the interests of the people in the 15th District, period. Period. And I firmly believe that my responsibility will be to work with people who have common interests, regardless of what side of the aisle they're on. I believe that we basically are going to want, unless there's money that's messing it up, I believe we're going to basically want some of the same things for our districts. And I think we may have some different ideas about how to get there, but I believe it's absolutely possible to compromise.
With that in mind, what do you see as the biggest difference between yourself and Representative Thompson, who's currently in office?
Bluntly, I'm sure he's a good person, but I think that if you take a look at who has funded his campaign, you'll see that he's got about $2 million and that it has come from large corporations. I believe that his donors are his first priority rather than the people of the 15th District. And I think that's probably the biggest difference. I'm not taking any money.
Is there anything that you can point to in politics today that you say, this is going well, I think they're getting this right, this is something that I see going well and I want to help keep that going?
Mm-hmm. I think that one of the single biggest things right now that's going well is that there has been a huge amount of energy among people stepping forward to know what's going on, to express their opinions, to march, to write letters to the editor, to run for office. There is a wave of energy among voters, frankly, of a variety of type of interests that I think we haven't seen since the 1960s. And I think it's spectacular. And I think the marches, the Women's March, the movement for Black Lives, Me Too movement, Occupy Wall Street. We've had a string of it now for about 15 years or so of the American citizens recognizing that we've got to come forward, pay attention, get involved, and make our votes count. And that's exciting.
Yeah. The last question I have for you today
Sure.
involves education.
Okay.
If we can go back to education for
Absolutely.
a minute. Because it sounded like a lot of the problems, or maybe some of the problems that the district is facing, comes from being poverty and a lack of education. How do we get more access for education to people? How do we get people motivated to want to go to school and show them that advancing your education is lucrative?
Well, I think that's kind of a complex thing in a few ways. One, in that my focus and a lot of my attention is higher education, because I have been in higher education for 16 years. But I think a lot of our challenges also stem from the way in which education is funded within the state. And frankly, I think there's a disparity, and that there's lots of school districts, rural areas in particular, that have been hit very hard. And so I think that when our schools are struggling to give quality education and access to resources to students, I think it makes it difficult for students to take as fully advantage as they need to. You can see, as a teacher, as a professor, when I work with freshmen, I can tell you where they came from by the writing, the quality of the writing that they do when they come in. Yeah. You can tell. And a lot of what we're having to do is play some catch up. So I think that there's a real big chunk of this that is about working with how we're funding education at the K through 12 levels, pre-K through 12 levels in the state, to ensure that all students have access to equitable and good quality education, and gets them started. That said, I also think there's two other issues that are probably closer to where my area of interest is in terms of a congressional level. One is that I have taken a stance publicly that I support tuition-free public education. And I'm sitting here at IUP and well aware that perhaps those in our administration right now say, "What are you saying?" You know, we're struggling as it is. But and I agree with that. But regardless, I think that there should be a public higher education option for people that is tuition free, as a means of equalizing the playing field for all. Number one. Number two, I also believe that our current system of student loans is ridiculously out of control in terms of structure. I think that the interest rates are obscene and need to be dropped dramatically. This should be a mechanism for supporting students, not crippling them for the next 30 years. And I think it does in lots of ways. It keeps them from taking full part in the economy, buying a house, having kids, you know, that kind of thing. And so I also think that while we have some programs that are in place that permit options for taking particular kinds of work with the idea that it brings loan forgiveness, they haven't been fleshed out well. They are not fair and balanced in terms of what they're doing. And a lot of people have taken part in them only to find that their loans are not forgiven. So there have been some real problems with that, and I think that has to be looked at. That should be much more widely available for folks. So those are some of the things. I'm not in favor of the voucher system. I think that is a bad idea, and I also do support as well, one last thing, I support growing access as well to good vocational training in the trades. And I think that one of the mechanisms for doing that is apprenticeships through unions. They've been doing that for a long time, and they're very good at it. So I think that we need to be looking at education very broadly, K through 12, colleges and universities, but also education for the trades too. And there should be public options that make it affordable for people to get the education that they need. I don't think it's a question of motivation. I think it's a question of access and affordability.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Sure thing.
On that note, I think we are about out of time today. I would sincerely like to thank Dr. Susan Boser for being with me today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. On behalf of our director, Mr. Chris Barber, and video assistant, Mr. Matthew Humphrey, I am Dr. Stephen Kleinman. Thank you for tuning in, and good day.